former diplomat, a poet, and a prominent anti-war advocate, Peter Dale Scott is joining us now on RT. Thank you very much for your time, sir. I'm not sure many Americans realize that, but democracy and freedom have become very toxic and often misused words in diplomatic language. Why do you think such a concept as democracy is being so grossly misused?
Well, I think it's true that, especially in the last 15, 20 years, that America has used the slogans of democracy and freedom as a way of expanding their sphere of influence in the world. And so you get these color revolutions, for example. Sometimes, and you can't judge all of them on the same. Sometimes there is a basis, a popular basis. For example, we have these two foundations, one Democrat, one Republican, doing what the CIA used to do, putting money into other countries' elections. That I think is quite inappropriate. Yes, I would like to see more democracy and freedom in the world, but it has to be autochthonous. It has to grow out of the country in question, and it's not something that you can sort of blast in. And then finally you have Libya, which is a scandal. That was done in the name of a Libyan spring, but that was totally pushed from outside. And from the very beginning it was violent. It wasn't a popular movement. It was military cadres came in with support and training from outside. So we're seeing a lot of social change, and some of it is good and some of it is partly good and bad, and some of it I think that history is going to judge the Libyan thing from a very negative assessment of what was done against Gaddafi.
I was in Libya just this past December, and what I heard from many people is that the way they envisage the Libyan revolution is that everything, the country will stay the same, they will get the same social benefits, they will enjoy the same standard of living, but the only thing that would change is that Gaddafi would be gone. And I think sometimes that American foreign policy makers suffer from the same degree of idealism. Do you think it's really idealism or the lack of any serious analysis or consideration on the part of people who make these decisions to throw full U.S. weight behind any particular movement?
I think the big difference between British interventions in the Third World and American interventions is that the British at least usually knew the languages of the countries they went into. They had a certain degree of knowledge. I think American policies are usually dictated by amazing ignorance. In the case of Libya, for example, I think that the Americans who got involved, and the French, they did with the idea that everybody hated Gaddafi, and that all you had to do was give a little push to a popular uprising and poof, Gaddafi would be gone. In fact, Gaddafi had a great deal of support, tribal support, but not just tribal support, because of his social programs, which were progressive and generous. And so the result is a year of chaos, to which we don't really see an end at this point. And so I think it's the whole thing. I'm hoping that at some point Americans will get sick and tired of these nasty interventions which blow up in their face. I mean, Iraq now, I think most Americans wish they had never heard of Iraq.
Syria is now a lot in the headlines, and the United States has been very open about its desire to see Bashar al-Assad step down.
Yes.
What I would like to ask you is, it's assumed that, we all assume that, and it's true that Syria doesn't have a very long track record of political pluralism, but this is a country that's long been proud of its religious diversity and tolerance, and this is also, some would say, a measure of democracy. It's important, yes, for the country to have. And already we see Syria suffering a great deal from Islamic militancy, and the recent explosions in Damascus is another example of that. My question to you is, when you consider pragmatically, when you consider U.S. interest in the region, wouldn't it be better for the U.S. interest, for the interest of Israel, to deal with autocratic but predictable regimes rather than groups that you can absolutely never predict their future actions?
Well, I do agree with you. Well, I talk about deep politics, about the things that we don't see in the newspapers, but I've read more than one place that U.S. Special Forces went into Syria as early, it was, I think, last December, before the Syrian Spring, and were already training resistance groups in techniques of street resistance, so that America was stirring up the pot. You know that American foreign policy has taken a very bad turn since what we call 9/11, the September 11th, 2001 attacks. And we know for a fact that the Cheney, who was the vice president, but the power man in that regime, Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, their response to 9/11 immediately was, we have to go after all these countries that are enemies in the area. And one of the countries that was named back in, this is September, October in 2001, they named Afghanistan, but they named Iraq. Iraq was #1. Afghanistan, Somalia, Libya, and Syria. Now, what do all these countries have in common? Well, I think we have to see that at one point in the past, they had been states allied with Russia and the Soviet Union, and that it looked like a concerted effort to replace an area of Soviet influence with an area of American influence. We have a General Wesley Clark who was in the Pentagon in 1991 through 2001, and it's he who's told us about there was a plan to go after all these countries, which we've now seen being implemented. And one of the people who talked to him about the plan, he talked about the window of opportunity now that the Soviet Union is gone. Russia will be in too confused a state to be able to resist, so that all of this should be done quickly. So it was very sinister, a play for pure dominance in the world. And I don't think there's much popular support in the American people for this. It was a group of neocons. They were special cliques, oil companies. They had their interests in global domination. And I'm very disappointed that the American people haven't done more to stop this, because it's become very dangerous to the world and, as you're suggesting, dangerous to the interests, the real interests of the Americans as well.
I would like to ask you a question about journalism and American journalism in particular. What I find very strange is that, on one hand, the idea and the tradition of critical thinking is very strong in American journalism, but when you are dealing with the countries whose interests are not aligned with the interests of the United States, say whether it's Libya, Syria, Russia, Iran, and the list can go on, it is very easy and it takes very little time for American journalists to demonize those countries. Iran and Ahmadinejad is a very good example. Gaddafi was a good example. My question to you, what's the problem here? Is it the lack of critical thinking on the part of American media, or probably on the part of the American audience who is taking those things so lightly?
Well, I think the problem is not a problem of the journalists, but there have been structural changes in the American media that are very relevant here. There's been a lot of concentration of ownership, a lot of overlap between the corporations that own the media and own the other corporations, so that, and then there's the role of advertising, for example, that you don't have, when we had the Vietnam War, we had a cadre of American journalists in Vietnam who started telling the truth about how badly that war was going. We didn't have that in Iraq because the journalists were embedded, And besides, the newspapers had changed so much, they weren't interested in playing that kind of role. You're getting a kind of corporate superstructure to American society in which the media and the financial interests and the defense industry and the oil companies are all part of one huge conglomerate. It's very important for the future of the globe to have good communications. That means we have to have good journalism, and it's a great problem that the American corporate superstructure of the media is less and less amenable to objective journalism.
And finally, if I may ask you about the U.S. presidential elections, which are just a few months away, and so far we have heard very little, if any, debate on foreign policy issues.
Right.
And my question is whether it is because American people don't know or simply don't care about what is being done abroad on their behalf.
There is, you know, in America a very a long time tradition of bipartisan foreign policy. The trouble is that right now American foreign policy ought to be very controversial. We're doing things which are way beyond what traditionally Americans would do, so it should be debated. But no, it's the same big money that contributes to both parties. And there are some issues which you are allowed to debate. Healthcare is being debated, certainly, very energetically. But the question of whether we should be in Afghanistan is not being debated. And it makes me tear my hair because I feel it should be. And we even have a big Occupy movement in America, but even the Occupy movement doesn't seem to be very interested in anti-war policy. We did, of course, in the Vietnam era, had a very strong, powerful anti-war movement, perhaps the biggest that the world had ever seen up to that time. We have nothing like that in America now, but largely because the Pentagon has so carefully strategized how to prevent an anti-war movement from emerging.
Thank you very much for your time, sir.
Thank you.